Hello, everyone, and welcome back to CL 100 Great Ideas of Politics and Ethics. So today we're going to talk about Plato's The Apology of Socrates, right? I'm just trying to push this little guy here up, but that's okay. It will go up. Now, last time, okay, there we go. Now it's perfect. So last time, I'm not going to read this again because we already discussed this, but this is the opening page of the Republic. So I just wanted to connect the two books, right? They are strictly connected. And I want to remind you the comment I made that very first page, it's like that idea of a symphony, right? That Plato is announcing the main topics and themes of the Republic. And one thing that is central to both the Republic and the context of Plato, right? Athens, and that was part of the historical discussion we had with the Peloponnesian War and the 30 Tyrants and so on. Um, and they were connecting, and I was saying, and that's already explicit or maybe implicit, but once you know it, it becomes obvious that Plato is showing you this tension I was arguing between power and knowledge, right? You have Polemarchus with the power, with the slaves, forcing Socrates, which is the wise, right? The wise man of Athens, like the wisest person of the city, right? And obviously, although Socrates is the smartest person, he has no say, right? Because power wins, right? It trumps knowledge as or reason. That's part of the underlying theme of the Republic and of Athens as well. As I said, and that's what today's book is going to talk about, the apology, right? Socrates was condemned to death, right? He was trialed and he would drink the hemlock, which is the poison which killed him. We saw that picture last time. And you see here, Socrates said, our persuading, isn't it possible, right, that we can persuade you? And then I mentioned that Polemarchus' answer is very interesting because he says, can you really persuade if we don't listen, right? And essentially, the court didn't listen to Socrates, wasn't it? He eventually, of course, wasn't able to persuade although I'm going to show you, and you probably noticed that yourself if you read the apology, that he doesn't try very hard to persuade, right? We're going to get to that eventually. We're going to evaluate if the trial was fair and what were Socrates' arguments and if they were, and if they should have let him go or not. And you're going to see that Socrates kind of accepted it quite easily, right? He didn't make an effort, right? And we'll get there. But the point is, right, that um, if you have a powerful group, it's possible that that powerful group will control which ideas are possible or not. That was the discussion, right? That's the birth of philosophy. And what Socrates essentially was trying to do is to interrogate everyone, ask them questions. As you saw in the Republic, he goes around asking people, right, what is justice? And he asks a lot of questions and he's trying to get to the bottom of it, right? And that's what a philosopher is essentially, right? A person who investigates those sorts of questions. Um, okay, and we talked about this, but I just wanted to, now that you read the apology, that you think about this again, that opening passage and how that's so strictly related to the apology and to what happened, right? Um, Now, obviously, it's called the apology because that's Socrates defending himself, right? That's the idea. That's what, if you ask anyone, why is the book called The Apology of Socrates? What does that mean? That person will say, well, that apology means defense, right? Socrates defending himself. But I want to argue here that there's actually a second meaning, right? Not that Plato meant it like that, but when you read the book, and that's partially what I already started hinted at. that Socrates didn't really defend himself so much as he defended the philosopher, right? The right to be himself. At one point later there's this quote: "The unexamined life is not worth living." It's when um, towards the end or the second half, I don't know, the second part of the dialogue. At one point, Socrates says, "Well, you're probably wondering." I could just, stay quiet, right? Stop asking so many questions that are kind of annoying everyone. Um, because they were saying that he was corrupting the youth, etc. And that's part of the idea there, that he was corrupting the youth because young people were following his steps and doing the same things as he was doing, especially challenging the status quo, right? That's why he was considered dangerous as well, because he's asking questions to the politicians and to the elite, honestly to everyone. But to powerful men who, and they had these, already established notions of what justice is, what virtue is. They had the answers to these questions, and Socrates, of course, starts to, turning everything upside down and arguing that it's not that simple, and that maybe we should rethink about what all of these big questions of life really means. And obviously, the elite or the group in charge isn't very interested in rethinking big questions, right? Because when you start thinking too much about these fundamental questions of the good life, eventually you could that could lead to political changes, isn't it? Because if you think about it, that's what the Republic, we didn't get to the we only read the first two books. There are 10 books, so we didn't get into details. But at the end of the day, it's the idea of structuring society, right? The country or the city in their case, because it's a city state, but structuring society with the philosopher queens and kings on top, right? Organizing everything. And then you had the warriors and the producing class, etc., the three classes. So the very idea of the republic was to try to figure out what's the ideal political system. How do you organize the institutions, right? As we discussed last time. So this idea of the young kids questioning everyone in charge about everything is perceived of as being a dangerous thing. That's the idea of corrupting the youth, right? Because they may start disagreeing with their parents, with the older generation. People have that have been living the status quo, and that's the danger there that's perceived as so. Um, but I was saying, when Socrates says, well, so why don't I just stay quiet? You may ask, right? So then I don't need to, you don't need to kill me necessarily. You're gonna argue. That's him talking to the jury, right? The people there in the audience, and he's saying, well, you're probably thinking that we could reach an agreement here, right? Where you don't necessarily need to kill me, and I don't need to take the poison, as long as I just stay quiet and stop asking people questions, etc. And then he says, I do not accept that because the unexamined life is not worth living. In other words, I'd rather die, which is what happened, than, be quiet, right? So what he's really doing is not defending himself in the sense that he's not defending his life. What he's defending is the right to be himself, right? He's defending the philosopher. It's the apology, in other words, of philosophy, not of Socrates itself. He chose to die in order to defend philosophy, right? To become a martyr as he did. Um, and I believe intentionally so, right? You can see that a little bit when he's like, well, I'm old, I'm 80 years old, and or 70, right? And then, my life's not going to be very long, etc. Um, so he recognizes this, that he's going to be a martyr, and there's going to be people following him. We're also going to talk about that a bit later, but um, so what he was defending, right, and the apology was the not to himself, but the right to be himself, the right to ask questions, the right to philosophize, right, to be the philosopher. Okay, and philosophy, just for the interested in languages in Greek, the word philos is like friend, okay? And then sophy is knowledge or reason. So philosophy is the friend of reason or the friend of knowledge. So essentially he's defending that right to ask questions about everything. Okay, that's what I want you to understand if you didn't realize that, right? So I want you to notice that. That's interesting. Okay. Now there's two different kinds of rhetoric, and you've seen Socrates in the Republic using the first one, dialectics, right? Um, Socrates is known for this idea of dialectics or dialogue as being the method of philosophy. Right. This method, you saw him using it in the Republic when he was kind of proving everyone wrong, right? Which is different than proving that he is right, right? These are two different things. Socrates showed that everyone's concept of justice was wrong, but he never provided his own concept, right? He doesn't provide it anywhere. Um, so, if you read the whole book, the 10 books, I mean, the whole Republic, then you can sort of um, understand what Plato's idea of justice is. But Socrates, the character, he goes around asking questions and asking, right? So he is excellent at dialectics and this exchange, right? When it's a conversation, when there's two different people, which is completely different from a lecture or convincing an audience, which would be the type two, proving I'm right. Hmm? So it's maybe you could be great at proving people wrong, which Socrates is. So he basically has to find any inconsistency with the argument of the other person. Okay, that's when you're great at dialectics, right? At this idea, because if you're good at logical reasoning and you're good at paying attention to the other person's argument and then finding a hole in the argument, just some logical inconsistency. That's what, or a counterexample. That's what Socrates mostly does, right? He finds always a counterexample and tries, not always, but remember with Capitulus when he's saying, well, to give back what's owed, right? He says, oh, but what if you borrow a sword and then from a friend, and then when you're about to give it back, your friend went crazy, so you know that your friend's gonna kill you or kill someone else should you steal, etc. So he found a counter example to explain why Capitalis's definition of justice isn't always right. It could be mostly right, but not always right, isn't it? So that's the first type of rhetoric which Socrates is the master of. Okay, he's known for that. So Socratic dialectic that became known after his name because he's so good at it, right? He didn't write any book, especially because of this idea that he didn't think he knew the truth, right? He didn't think that knowledge could be crystallized because knowledge is constantly changing. So he himself doesn't want to commit to one view or write what justice is. He doesn't want to write a book explaining what justice is because he's trying to find it, figure it out, right? As you've learned on the reading the apology, he explains that his whole life is or not his whole life, but ever since he went to the Delphi, and to the Oracle of Delphi, right? I'm going to show you that as well. There's a slide in a second. But he explains that ever since he went there, he's been trying to figure out what virtue is, right? If he knew what the answer was, then maybe he would be more comfortable with writing books, right? But first, before that's his mindset. I believe, right? I mean, it's 400 BC, so we don't know exactly for sure. I've explained that before. We're trying to understand Socrates based on Plato's dialogues, right? And to give an example, if you use the version that I shared with you, the project, the free version, right, that I shared with you, and if you read the introduction before the book actually starts, Um, you notice that there is this interesting discussion about a different version of Socrates' apology or defense, which was written by another person, Xenophon, right? If you read that, you've noticed that he's arguing how Xenophon's version is much more dry compared to Plato, isn't it? So I mentioned this before. It's you're reading Plato, so it is based on Socrates' idea, but Plato may be inflating it a bit or making Socrates sound, who knows, right, smarter or whatever than he actually was. In the sense, he may be trying to help contribute somehow into making Socrates a hero, right? Especially after what everything's happened, etc. I'm not saying that's exactly what it is. I'm just saying that it's Xenophon's version is much drier, and Socrates is more dry. And here he's very eloquent and this genius, right? A great, you know. Um, then it might be that maybe it's a midway between the two versions. We don't know exactly, right? But one thing that transpires is that Socrates is anyway better at this first type of rhetoric and dialectics than at the second time of convincing an audience, right? Because here at his trial, he has to prove that he's innocent, right? It's different from engaging in a dialogue, and so you're not trying to find holes in anyone's argument. You have to come up with your own argument. And I'm not saying he's bad at it. He's great, right? But what I'm trying to explain is in the Republic, you see that he's much more comfortable and that he's a master of dialectics. That's what he's known for. And he's less comfortable here when he's trying to convince an audience. In the very beginning, he says it himself. He's like, pardon me if my language is inappropriate. I'm using the same language I use in Niagara, right? When I'm in the street, like in that place where the famous place in Athens where people would have discussions, etc. But you see him saying that, I'm not used to this, so I'm a bit like out of my comfort zone, right? And yeah, I mean, he does do a good job defending himself, I think, up to some point, um, but then he doesn't really try very hard, especially towards the end. At some point, it seems like he is trying to annoy everyone and almost trying to be sentenced to death. So he becomes a martyr. That's one way of reading it, right? And there's a little bit that you get a little bit that feeling that Socrates is kind of okay with it, that he understands that his impact is going to be so great afterward. Um, but that's not all there is to it, right? The other reason why he acts the way he is, and then he explains that there is a voice inside his head that he's had since he's a kid, that is God communicating with him, um, or some spirit or of some sort, right? And then he's saying, I always know what I should do or shouldn't do because this voice will always tell me not to do something when I'm about to do it. If it's a wrong thing to do. So it always protects me from doing the wrong thing. And he said, so basically, I when I came to the trial, I didn't even prepare my speech because kind of like this voice. See, it seems it sort of told him that he shouldn't prepare for it, and that was the right thing. He was convinced that what actually happened at the end was the right thing to happen because uh, the voice never told him anything that he shouldn't have done, right? As he was about to do it. So um, there was this divine voice commanding him, and so he's kind of convinced that that's the way things should have gone. You can see that quite clearly from the book. But the other thing I want to put in context is Aristophanes' clouds that gets mentioned. Socrates is talking about this in the book, right? And he's saying, well, so the reason he talks about this is he starts by arguing that before he can defend himself of the accusations of Meletus, right, and the others, he first has to defend himself from the accusations he's been receiving all his life, or not really all his life, but for years and right for decades, right? So you see that this feud is a the skirmish is very long. It's not something that just happened for the past month. It's been happening for years and years. People are upset with Socrates. Probably the politicians and people in charge are worried, because he's questioning everything, as I mentioned, right? The status quo, etc. Um, and so he's saying, I get this fame, and largely because of Aristophanes' play, which is called The Clouds. And then this play, it shows Socrates flying in the clouds in a basket, like as a lunatic, right? Um, and Aristophanes arguing that Socrates is kind of trying to understand natural science, and where storms come from, where these natural phenomena come from, when he shouldn't be questioning these things because God's created these phenomena, etc. Right? And Socrates saying, no, 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 I'm not talking about natural phenomena at all. I just discuss with people what is virtue, what is justice, right? In other words, he's only interested in moral philosophy, right? But Aristophanes is arguing that he's interested in explaining these sort of, that he's trying to explain scientifically, as it were, stuff that he should be sticking his nose in. And this happened a lot in the history of science, right? When some scientists argued that Earth wasn't the center of the you know the sun was the center, not the Earth, and people were um, sentenced to death, etc., for arguing things like that, right? So there's this conflict between religious and science, and that was also operating here. Aristophanes was criticizing Socrates for being kind of a lunatic, right? Kind of living in the clouds here. That's what's happening in the play. He's always like above people, so trying to like be God in a way, right? That's also what he's doing in the clouds there. That he, knows the answers to everything, even to the why is it that it rains and the sun and the lightnings, where they come from, as if he were trying to explain all these natural phenomena only using science without using any reference to religion. That's what Aristophanes is saying here in the clouds, and Socrates defends himself by arguing, no, 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 I'm just interested in knowing what justice is and what virtue is. What you saw in the Republic, right? So that Socrates seems quite honest here. It seems like a caricature of Socrates, really, what Aristophanes is doing. But this book is actually really impactful. As Socrates is arguing himself, it did, let's say, back then, influence the public narrative, right? So this book would play the role of mainstream media, if you want to think about it like that, right? That you mentioned when you mainstream media, and nowadays there's a lot of different options of what you can watch, right? But you know that 20 years ago there were just a few channels. Before the internet, there were just a few channels, right? Television channels. And even today, that there are a few channels that are big and so many people watch them, right? So the media, by crafting a narrative that may or may not be true, can influence people in going in a certain direction, isn't it? So the clouds had this effect too, because it was a popular play that cost very little, right? It was very cheap to go there. So everyone would go and watch it, and it was funny, right? It was humor, not a deep book like The Republic discussing philosophy and not moral philosophy, right? So what I'm saying is, um, certainly, um, certainly most people who, or yeah, probably most people who went and watched the play, Klaus, they only, and Socrates even mentions that it's very, very cheap. It only costs one drachma, right? He mentions that at one point. In other words, it's very, very cheap. Everyone goes there and watches it. And so everyone has this conception, but these same people don't necessarily buy books and try to write. They didn't read Plato's Republic, for instance, or something, or the equivalent, right? Other books that maybe portrayed Socrates in a more realistic light. So that's quite important. It's also important because the trial itself, you have to understand the people who went there to the trial, right? The 500 people who voted, they were actually paid. Okay, so back then in Greece, you would be paid to go there and participate in the court, right? It was a democracy in that sense that, people would go there. But they would receive, in right, there was the people, it was actually everyone voting, so it was democratic in that sense, as I mentioned last time. But you would receive, a small amount of money to compensate for the fact that that day you didn't go to work, just a compensation. Okay, you can think about it like that. Um, but it was a small amount of money, meaning that people who didn't have jobs or who were that rich, right, would go there, would have an incentive to go and participate to make a little bit of money, right, just to make ends meet, etc. Whereas a rich person wouldn't have, so much incentive. It wasn't like today where you get selected, right? You get polled and you have to go. It was voluntary, and people could go there. Anyone could go, and then you make some money, right? Um, so that means that in a way, the people who were voting that day, they weren't the elite or the richest people of society, absolutely, right? And it was people that probably watched the clouds because it was a popular, popular play that was cheap and everybody watched it back then. And soccer, that's what Socrates is talking about. So he's saying many people here grew up with this image of, that I'm this crazy lunatic that is um, contesting everything, that is trying to explain stuff that only God, right, knows. And so, but that's not true. He's arguing, right? I'm only interested in moral philosophy, as I said. What is justice? What is virtue? What is the good life? So, just having a sip of water here. Now, I want to talk about a bit about these things, right? I'm not going to answer yes or no, but I want you to think about this. Throughout the history of philosophy and the history of the world more generally, right? Everyone who knows about Socrates has this image of it being unfair, right? That Socrates was an innocent person. Basically, he just got killed because he asked too many questions. So we have this image based on the way we see society today, right? The idea of free speech being so important, etc., the First Amendment. We have these ideas of, the Bill of Rights. I mean, more general, that um, it seems like Socrates was killed for just, and that free speech should have protected him, right? But I want you to understand that it's not just that. It's more complicated than that, right? So the things he were charged for were two charges: corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods, right? So there is something into it, right? That's what I'm thinking. Maybe Socrates um wasn't innocent, right? In the sense that in their context, in other words, if you were living, that's what I want you to think about. If you were living there back there, maybe you wouldn't have thought he was innocent, right? And maybe it was fair from their perspective, from the perspective of the court, because if it was true, if it were true that he didn't believe in the gods, this is very important. That's one of the accusations. And think about it this way: you're in Athens in 400 BC, right? Um, and then you're there in court, and that person, Socrates, is being accused for that, for not believing in the gods. And maybe what you are thinking is, well, if this guy really does not believe in the gods, um, the thing is, um, the gods may crush us, all of us, the whole city, right? Because of impiety, the gods could That's what they thought back then, right? Or many people would think that the gods couldn't flood the city or throw thunder lightnings and destroy everything, burn everything to the ground because of this person who isn't pious. So maybe you're thinking, well, if he's really, really an atheist, right? I'd rather him, be sentenced to death for the sake of Athens to save the whole city. Um, then let him live. It's possible that a lot of people fear that. Okay, it's 400 BC, right? And so they definitely could be afraid of the consequences of being punished by gods. So when you're saying it was Socrates' trial fear, was he innocent? Okay, fair enough from our perspective, right? In the United States in 2024, with free speech, it definitely seems like he is innocent and the trial was not fair. But go back in time, from their perspective, maybe it was, right. We're just valuing things from using our lenses instead of what people thought back then. So that's anachronistic, right? We're answering to a question about the past with our current standards, and that's wrong also. Okay, so without trying to say yes or no to the question, I'm saying that the trial was fair and he was not innocent to the extent that people believed he was an atheist. Okay, and maybe even for the first one accusation, because the second one is clear. The example I said is, if you think God will flood the city and kill all of us, then fine. I'd rather, right, condemn that person unfortunately to death. Otherwise, he will die anyway, right? All of us will. So at that point, if that's what you believe, then okay. Um, but maybe even corrupting the youth, right? Like the young, whatever. Because if you think that, I mean, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying try to open your mind and think from a different perspective, right? From someone from Greece. They could think about this in terms of, well, he's turning all of these young people against us, right? The old guardians of the city they lead, right? The parents of these young and powerful, right? Like Polemarchus and, Glaucon especially, right? Remember Glaucon, that kind of person who's trying to learn from Socrates, and then they can be thinking, well, if we just let him go, he's corrupting young people in the sense that they will overthrow the regime and maybe they'll want to institute something other than the democracy that we now have, right? Which, you know, at least the people in charge, right? The politicians that were elected, etc. They were part of the status quo, like the system as it was, and they did not want to change that. So sure, killing him seems very, very unnecessary, but that was actually Socrates' choice to some extent too, right? I mean, okay, we'll see it. Let me explain this last point. And in order to understand this, you have to understand a bit the structural trials in ancient Greece, right? And you see that from the apology itself. When you look at the how the apology is structured, right? The different parts of it, you can see that first Socrates does the defense speech, right? So he tries to defend himself. This is the biggest chunk of the dialogue. The biggest part of it is this longer the defense speech. Then there's the verdict, and then people say either guilty or not guilty, right? And people say guilty, and they said guilty by a small margin. It was a 60 difference vote, right? So 230 to 170. Um, no, that's wrong. 280 to 220 it would have been because there were 500 people. So much so that Socrates says, well, if only 30 people had changed their vote, I wouldn't be found guilty, right? So it was 280 to 220 roughly, right? A 60 vote difference. Um, and they say guilty by a small margin. Socrates says, I'm surprised. Actually, I thought it would have been by a wider margin, etc. But okay, he does get, uh, he's found guilty, but then they need to decide what the penalty is going to be. Okay. And the way it was structured, the trials, that's interesting because in order to keep some sort of checks and balances, right, to keep it fair, they allowed both sides to suggest a penalty, right? So the prosecutor's assessment was, he said Socrates must be tried, must, take the um, take the poison and die, right? He should die, sentenced to death. That was his assessment. He should be sentenced to death. Um, and then Socrates has the chance to make his counter assessment and suggest whatever he wants, right? Um, and this is where I'm saying that he didn't make a big effort to to live. I mean, if he wanted to defend himself rather than philosophy, right? The Apology of Socrates. If he just wanted to live, regardless of everything, he could easily have gotten away by um, assessing his penalty as I'll be banned from Athens. I'll leave the city. People would be fine with that. Or I will never again engage in these behaviors, right? I'll just keep it to myself. And if he um, assessed, if his counter assessment were, okay, I'll stop the, inquiring everyone about virtue and justice. I will just, um, keep my investigations to myself, reading books, whatever, and we'll stop corrupting the youth or whatever. Um, it seems people would probably have accepted it, right? Because here is where it gets very well, it seems like he's making fun of people, right? Because his counter assessment, he begins by saying, okay, first of all, I'll tell you what I deserve. And what I deserve really is a prize, right? Not really a penalty, but a prize. I should be treated the same way the winners of the Olympic Games are treated. And you know that the Olympic Games started in Greece, right? So around that period, there were already the Olympic Games. And Socrates is saying, you know how the winners of the Olympic Games, when they come back to Athens, they're treated to a feast, right? A banquet. So, lots of food and people celebrate that they won the, the gold medal and etc. And Socrates is saying, well, if they get that, I should also get that. Because honestly, what I give Athens is a lot better than what they give you. They only give you the appearance, okay, and I give you the truth. Remember the allegory of the cave we talked about. That's what Socrates is talking about, the difference between seeming and being. Okay, we talked about that last time. The difference between what you see inside the cave, which are just the shades, right? The appearance of reality versus reality itself, which is outside of the cave. You can only see that the true essence of things by studying and becoming wise and a philosopher through training, right? Becoming intellectual, as it were. Um, yeah, but here he's talking about this issue of the difference between seeming and being, right. Okay, and then of course the jury gets to decide between these two things, right? But yeah, just to finish this, what I was saying. So the sportsmen, right, in the Olympic Games, they only seem, because yes, bring you pleasure and happiness, but that's not the true happiness in his eyes, right? Greek philosopher Plato and Aristotle had this idea that happiness is not pleasure. It's not necessarily having a beer or playing video games or whatever it is, going to the park, playing with your friends, whatever it is. That can be pleasure and fun, but that's not what happiness is. They thought, right? They had this idea of happiness as being the good life, the virtuous life, right? So being a happy person meant being fulfilled, right? This idea of something that's wholesome, right? They associated happiness with that kind of stuff, as of it being virtuous and sort of right thing to do, right? So Socrates is saying, sports, that's the seeming, right? That's our reality itself, right? It seems good, but it's not really, really good. What really, really matters is what I am doing, right? Because I'm telling you what justice is and what virtue is and what the good life is. So I'm giving you something real to all citizens of Athens. I'm giving you this thing, and you should retrieve it to me the same way you do to Olympic game winners, right? So, it's a little bit obviously this, it seems very provocative, and it seems like Socrates is being obnoxious, really, right? And you can understand um, how he offended many people. He talks about it himself during the how he had enemies for many years because he was going around proving everyone wrong, and people obviously felt frustrated, and um, he started having people who didn't like him. But okay, so you had this structure, right? And then the jury eventually decides that Socrates does deserve the death penalty, as you know, and then there are the final words. Now, there's one thing you wouldn't know, which is very important, which is the difference between public trials and private trials. Now, these are the public trials, they are organized like this, and public trials are for serious offenses, right? Stuff that would, could lead to death penalty, to stuff that is considered very serious. Now, private trials, on the other hand, are for minor, or not necessarily minor, but private trials are when you committed something which is not intentional, right? It was a mistake and you didn't know what you're doing, it was just a mistake. That shouldn't be a public trial because you shouldn't be condemned to death, right? In those cases, when it's unintentional, Socrates makes the argument at one point, the Apology is making the argument that if what he's doing is unintentional, then that whole trial shouldn't even be happening because it should have been a private trial instead of a public trial. And that's quite interesting. So I just want to explain you this. So when he's discussing with Meletus about the corruption of the youth or not, he raises this question of the nullity of procedure, right? Which was what I was just saying. Socrates says, either I do not corrupt the young, or if I do, it is unwillingly. Now, if I corrupt them unwillingly, the law does not require you to bring people to court for such unwilling wrongdoings, but to get hold of them privately. And he goes on to say, because, and then you should educate me, right? If I'm corrupting the youth, because I didn't know I was doing it, he's arguing. So if it's unwillingly, you should have trialed me privately and educated me, right? Showed me what I was doing, and because if I knew I was corrupting them, right? That's not what I'm doing, not willingly at least. From my point of view, I'm not doing that. Socrates is saying. And then, if it were private, he would never have been sentenced to death, right? So, this point is interesting because it's one of the strongest arguments Socrates makes, I think, throughout in defending himself, because there is really the case, it seems, right? He's making of nullity of procedure, and then that maybe the trial shouldn't even be happening, right? Um, but I think Socrates doesn't try very hard, as I said, because he does mention this and then he just let it go, it seems. I mean, he doesn't insist on it, right? He should have stressed this point so much more, and he shouldn't have talked about that he deserved a banquet and free food and a dinner and etc., right? That he should, that he's the son of God. We're gonna get to this, but he was very obnoxious instead of stressing his stronger arguments, which he should have, I think, if he just wanted to get out of there and defend himself rather than philosophy, right? That's the argument I'm making here. So this one is a very strong argument and very interesting to, especially for people going to law school or interested in the constitutional issues. Okay, so what does he say? What does Socrates say about corrupting the youth? Well, he's saying, well, the young men, they follow me out of their own free will, right? I'm not really like influencing or trying to, right? Not willingly. People just follow me. Like, what can I do about it? I'm not guilty of people listening to me or following me. I'm not trying that, right? And he says, I've never been anyone's teacher, right? I've never charged money for the lectures as the sophists do, as Thrasymachus does in the Republic, right? So I've never been anyone's teacher. If anyone's accusing me that I'm making money out of this, I'm not. Um, and he says, if anyone wants to listen, well, never forced anyone really, right? People are just, they have free will. So this is part of what he's saying, right? That, people follow him probably because he's interesting, right? He's saying, well, I guess I'm clever and people like seeing me destroying everyone, right? Just showing people how wrong they are about everything, because that's what he does, right? He shows people that they don't actually know what justice is, and then they feel like embarrassed, right? Because these are important, wise men of Athens and politicians and etc. And he goes around showing everyone that they're actually wrong. And then the young people are walking around and seeing him doing this and probably laughing at older people. You see what's going on here. So Meletus, etc., would be parents of these people, right? Of one of these, young men who are following Socrates around. That's why he's being trialed here too, right? Apart from these two official trials that you're seeing, there's this unofficial issue of Socrates kind of disturbing everyone, right? Making people feel um, um, yeah, annoyed with him really. But then at one point Malus says he says Socrates says that is that the sun is stone and the moon is earth, and Socrates replies, Malthus, do you think you're prosecuting Anaxagoras? Uh, and this is very interesting because this is the thing we mentioned before, and Socrates talks about when there's this vision of his, when I was talking about the clouds, Aristophanes, right? Basically is there's prejudice, right? There's all these notions about what Socrates believes, which are propagated by Aristophanes in his play The Clouds. So in The Clouds, Aristophanes, Socrates is played as this crazy person that thinks that the sun is stone and the moon is earth, right? So kind of not believing in gods. But Socrates says that's Anaxagoras' idea, not mine, right? Do you think you're persecuting him? That's ridiculous. Why would you attribute that idea to me? Everyone who's read the book knows it, that it's Anaxagoras' idea, not mine. So that's the thing I was mentioning earlier. How most people saw the play, but they didn't necessarily buy the books and read the current theories, such as this one, that the sun was a stone and the moon, right? Okay. But then, all right, so basically he's saying, no, this is not my idea, right? And then he's saying, I do believe in God actually, because and you yourself, you are saying it yourself. So he does that thing he's good at that I told you before, the dialectics, right? He finds a hole in the argument, in Malthus' argument, because he says, look, Malthus, you're saying that I don't believe in the gods, that's the charge. But you're also saying that I believe in spirits, right? And these demons and spirits, like the voice he has inside his head, etc. And he's saying, but that's a contradiction because if I believe in spirits, and if we believe in Greece, right? If we believe that spirits are God, either one of them, they're either gods themselves, or they're kids, right? They're the children of the gods. But they've got to be one of these two options. That's what Socrates is saying. So he's saying, well, how can you tell me I believe in spirits, but I don't believe in God? That's a logical impossibility because spirits are either gods or children of God. So that doesn't make any sense, right? So it does. I mean, he does defend himself very well in terms of finding the logical inconsistency. And, as I said, again, first he's brilliant up to the point where he starts talking about I deserve to be treated in this feast and a banquet because I am I'm a gift to the city, and he starts getting very obnoxious. Now, this is when he starts getting very obnoxious, right? And that's what I want to talk about, the Oracle of Delphi. Now, this is the actual place in Greece, the Oracle of Delphi. And you see here the Python receiving the message from God, the representation of what Socrates is talking about in the Apology, right? Okay, and finally here, whenever you go to Athens next time, you can buy this shirt there. Everybody has it. My father has one actually. It's written very small here. The only thing I know is that I don't know anything. The very famous Socrates line, right? In Greek, but then it's in English here as well. And in this part here of the apology, Socrates says this, right? That the only thing he knows is that he doesn't know anything. That actually does make him wise and the wisest man of Greece. He's humble. That's the idea, right? He doesn't think that he knows what justice is or what virtue is, right? He knows that he doesn't know that. And in that sense, he actually is smart because the fact that he doesn't know it at least allows him to keep trying to understand where it is, right? And changing direction and searching for a new explanation as opposed to when you think you know the answer and it's the wrong one, you just, right, you stopped trying to figure it out, so you'll be wrong forever, right? So Socrates is saying, look, what happened with the Oracle of Delphi was my friend went to the Oracle of Delphi and asked if Socrates, right, if I were really the smartest, if I was the smartest man in the planet or in Greece, in Athens, and they said yes, right? So the oracle, right, apparently the message that the Python received was that indeed Socrates was the smartest person alive. And Socrates thought that was impossible, or at least that's his version, right? He's like, come on, I don't know anything. I'm ignorant. I don't know what justice is, what virtue is, right? These big moral questions, fundamental questions about what's the good life, right? What kind of life should we be leaving? What is excellence, right? That's the idea of virtue and justice here. What is just in the sense that what's the right thing to do? The just thing to do, right? The correct decision. When you have to make a decision, what's the just one? That also means what's the excellent or right, correct decision, right? I'm making. So Socrates is saying, if I were the smartest person, I would know answers to these questions that everyone wants to know, right? And I don't. Um, and so he said, okay, so if God is saying that, I have to understand what that means. That's probably just a riddle. He says I have to understand. There's probably a I have to interpret this and understand what it means. So he goes on this quest, right? He says, okay, let me go and talk to a very smart politician. And then in the apology, he's like, I'm not going to tell you his name. So you see that it's a real person that was probably even there. I mean, I don't know if the person was there, but everyone, I mean, he didn't want to say it because it was someone very famous, important, powerful, right? So he didn't want to say it. But he says, I went to that person and asked that person what was justice and virtue, the same things he asked in the Republic, and that person didn't know anything about it. And worse, the person was convinced that she knew it, right? And so he says, okay, fine. And then, I found the logical inconsistencies and showed that person that she actually didn't know it, right? And then he said, okay, so then I went to a poet because the politician, which was the wise intellectual or perceived as so back then, right? Um, Maybe nowadays we don't have that same image of the politician of being the wise, and but back then that's what they were thought of, right? It was a different society, also structured in a different way. So to be a politician, you had to be part of the elite and be educated and be well read, etc. So that was very different. But that's not very important. Um, not very important here. But the point is, he says, well, I went to the poets, right? Poets are also thought of as smart people, but different kind of knowledge, right? It's a different, they're more creative, etc. It's different from a politician, right? And he said, guess what? Same exact thing. Poets knew nothing about moral philosophy, justice, virtue. They were clueless. They didn't know anything about that. So they didn't know anything. And then he said, okay, so I kept trying, right? And then he says, I'll start going to sort of ordinary people, sort of like blacksmiths, right? And just, the workers, right? Just people producing anything, right? And here it's cool because he says, these manufacturers, these kind of people doing stuff, right? Manual stuff, labor. They were actually the wisest, he says, because at least they know actually how to do something. So if you could make tables or chairs, he said, they actually knew how to build these things, and I didn't. Socrates says I didn't know. So I learned those things from them, how they, do their trades, right? They know their trades at least, right? So in some sense, they were wiser. He says, the people you would least expect in theory were actually the wisest one, because at least they have practical knowledge, right, about the stuff they do. Like, so you flip burgers on McDonald's, right? You know how to do that, Socrates is saying, and I don't know how to do that. So I can learn that from you. And you're wiser than the poets and the politicians, which had no practical knowledge, only theoretical knowledge. In theory, sorry for the no pun intended, obviously, but in theory, they should have theoretical knowledge, right? But in practice, they didn't, Socrates said. So they actually didn't have any knowledge at all, right? Neither the speculative, abstract, theoretical knowledge of an intellectual, nor the practical one. Okay, but these, the blacksmith and people doing the manual laborers, they also made that same mistake, Socrates was going to argue, of thinking that they knew too much, of thinking that they knew what justice is and virtue is, and etc. And he's saying, well, here they are making the same mistake as the politicians and the poets, right? Because they're ignorant about their ignorance, right? They think that they know all of these things. They don't. So, that's the main problem for Socrates. When you think you know the things that you don't really know, right? Then you stop inquiring and you become stuck. So he's saying, okay, so I went, I talked with all these people and they're all ignorant. They don't know anything. And I don't know anything either. The difference is I'm aware of my ignorance. So I keep searching for the truth, and they think that they know the truth and they are not searching for anything. So in that sense, the Oracle of Delphi was right. That was my interpretation of it, right? And that's the shirt over here. That the only thing I know is that I do not know anything, right? That actually is very important to know that you don't know anything. That's the essence of science, right? When you think about science, the history of science, we never really know anything, right? We're just disproving stuff and learning by counterexamples or anomalies or new empirical evidence and new experiments, new theories, etc., hypotheses. We discard the old theory that was a paradigm, and there's a new paradigm constantly. We're constantly improving science, but we'll never get to the end result point, right? There's no end result. There's no way you can explain everything. It just keeps getting better and better. So Socrates here is representing really, the image of science as it has become, right? He was the first scientist, if you want, the first scientist we know about, I guess, and that you can see the clear image of what a scientist is in Socrates. He's representing this idea that all we have in physics, it doesn't matter, right? Or chemistry, etc. It doesn't matter. You have the hypothesis, the atom, and then you know that you've studied it in high school, right? How the theories of physics and chemistry, they progressed in time and kept improving, right? And now you have quantum theory and more advanced things, but these things will change in time as we create new theories, right? That idea is what Socrates is representing with this eternal search for truth, and their understanding that there is no such thing as figuring it out, right? And that's why he's so smart. He's the only person that knows that back then. Okay. Um, but essentially, he's saying, look, you're saying that I do not believe in gods, but all I'm doing is because of gods, right? The gods order me via that person, the Python who received the message. I was ordered by the god to teach you what virtue is. Not teach you by telling you what it is, but teach you that you don't know what it is, right? And then by learning that you don't actually know, then perhaps yourself you're going to start inquiring it again. So he's saying, I'm a gift from God to the city of Athens because I go around all day showing people that they don't really know those things that they thought they knew. And that's my mission. I was sent by God to do that. So you cannot argue that I'm corrupting, that I do not believe in the gods, because all I'm doing is to try to fulfill God's will. That's what Socrates is saying, right? So the accusation is it doesn't make sense, right? Uh, he says, if I haven't lived the life I lived, I might truly have justly been brought here for not believing that there are gods, disobeying the oracle, fearing that, and thinking I was wise when I was not. So I love this argument. He says, look, actually, if I weren't sort of not corrupting the youth, right? Because I'm accused of corrupting the youth because I'm essentially asking questions non-stop, right? About what is justice and showing that no one really knows. But he's saying, so I'm being accused for that and saying that I don't believe the gods. But it's the opposite, right? If I weren't asking questions, then I wouldn't believe in the gods because then I wouldn't be doing what the oracle told me to do, right? So then I would be disobeying the god, and then you could tell me that I'm an atheist, and then you could condemn me to death. But by doing so constantly all the time, I'm proving, right, that I am following God's will. Of course, no one knows this story of Socrates, right? If he's making this up, this whole story of the oracle, he says that there are people there to prove him. But I mean, this whole point of that he is doing what he's doing because he's following God's will. No one else can know, right? For sure, if he really had the revelation, right? Or if he is just using that argument, right, to escape. It's very hard to say. But it's a very good argument, I think, right? Because all he's doing is following God. That's what he's saying. So he cannot be accused of not believing in God. It's ridiculous. It's a very strong argument. Um, be sure that this is what God orders me to do. And I think there is no greater blessing for the city than my service to the God. So he tries to persuade people to think about only the best possible state of your soul. He says, this is my bless, right? The blessing from I am the a gift from God to the city, right? That's how he literally says it. And then he's saying the reason I deserve a celebration and free food, dinner, etc., is that I am here perfecting the state of your soul. I'm making you better people, right? Once I explained to you that you didn't know what justice is, now you can improve yourself. You were doing the wrong thing, in other words, right? Like Catholicus, who was doing sacrificing animals and thinking that's enough. That you could be a horrible person and you can just sacrifice animals and then you make we make peace with gods and that's just and a good life. Socrates is saying, no, that's not. I proved capitalists wrong. So I'm trying to make people better, right? Improve their souls. Um, and that's obviously a signal that God sent me in, etc. Right? Okay. Now, what was Plato's goal and what did Socrates actually say? We've talked a bit about this, right? There's no way we can know exactly if Plato is trying to, create a sort of hero or, how realistic that was. I think we talked a little bit about that, and what Socrates did actually say. But what about Socrates' goal, right? And I want to talk about this idea when he says towards the end, it's the Socrates prophecy, right? He talks about this. There will be more people to test you. There will be more of us, right? At the very end, after he's accused, right, and sentenced to death, etc., he says, listen, I got bad news for you. This is Socrates' prophecy, right? Others will come, and they will keep asking you questions. This young generation that you say I'm corrupting, it's too late now anyway. They've already learned it, and they're going to be worse than me. He says, they're going to ask even harder questions, and so um when he says that thing that there will be a whole generation following his steps, you could infer that he did want to become a martyr. Okay, that's a bit the idea. I'm not saying he wanted to die before anything, before the trial took place or anything, but he sensed, that's one interpretation, he sensed he would probably die anyway. And then he's thinking, well, I'm very old and I can either, live a few more years and it's going to be probably not great anyway. He does say that, right? And I'm poor on top of it. He was poor and old. And he's saying, well, being old and poor, not the greatest of life. I could do that for a few years. Or, he could become a martyr, right? He could become this model for the next generation to come. So part of why he's so annoying, obnoxious at points, right? There's this tension between a strong defense at points. You when you're listening to it or reading, right? But it feels like you're listening. Most of it seems, well, yeah, that's quite reasonable. He's not guilty, right? Most of the arguments I talked about, I personally think they're quite reasonable, but obviously it's up for you to make up your mind. But that contrasts with him, talking about the fact that he deserves a prize and not accepting to move to another city and right things like that. So maybe that's because he saw the potential for a whole new generation that wants to discuss what justice is and what is the good life, right? So the way he could make maximum impact was by becoming this martyr, by being, unjustly um, sentenced to death, and then people would um, have this empathy with him, the idea of a martyr, right? So maybe I'm suggesting that was Socrates' goal. Socrates himself suggests not goal in the sense that, he accepted that outcome, right, as not a tragic one, as we would think, but he saw the potential benefits of it. And he did become an inspiration for a bunch of people and this idea of civil disobedience. So Socrates was the first person really to talk about, not he doesn't use the words, right, civil disobedience, but when you read the Apology, that's what it is, right? Here you see Gandhi's passage, strength doesn't come from physical capacity, it comes from an indomitable will, but it's the same idea. I mean, all these three, Thoreau and Gandhi and Luther King are all known for this idea of civil disobedience, right? And I want to show you a passage where this is quite clear, I think. So it's this, what I was talking about. There will be more people to test you whom I now held back, but you did not notice it. You are wrong if you believe that by killing people, you will prevent anyone from reproaching you for not living in the right way. It is best and easiest not to discredit others, but to prepare oneself to be as good as possible. Right? So basically this I think this passage here shows this idea, right? It's best not by killing people as they were doing with him, right? But by learning how to live the just life, right? So all right, just a few more points I want to make. He also discusses this idea of private versus public life at one point, right? And there's this passage where Socrates says, a man who really fights for justice must lead a private, not a public life, if he is to survive for even a short moment. And if you remember, the reason he argues this is he says he had two experiences in public life. One of them was when he was a senator for a very short period, and he figured out that that wouldn't work for him because there was this episode during the Peloponnesian War, which we talked about last time, right? What happened was some soldiers were killed in battle, and then the generals didn't bring the bodies back, and they kind of abandoned them there, right? And they were sentenced to death, all of these soldiers, for not helping or bringing the bodies back. And Socrates says that everyone condemned the you know the the army there, the commanders of that army to death, but he was against that idea, and it was illegal, he argues even. So that was against the law. Um, Basically, what he's saying is, look, I was doing the right thing then, and I was respecting the law, and everyone voted against me. I was the only person actually following the Constitution, as it were, right? Not the Constitution, he doesn't call it like that, but that's the idea. That's how we would call it. So he says, look, I tried. I've been in part of a a public body, and we had to trial a person or a group of people, and I followed the law, and literally everyone else didn't. So I realized that if I did that, I wouldn't survive very long. I'd probably not be here now, he says. They would have killed me because I would always do the right thing, even if everyone else wanted to do the wrong thing. And people would try to put pressure on me on or whatever, and I'm sure they would just get rid of me sooner or later. That's what Socrates is arguing, right? So he says, I never lived a public life in the sense that I didn't want to be a politician. That's what he's saying, right? But he does live a public life in the sense that he's walking around and teaching people that, right? He is public in that sense, but he doesn't have a public office or something like that. That's what he's talking about. So should lead a private life in the sense that, engage with people or groups of people, but not as a politician, etc. And the second one is the 30 tyrants. Okay, that's the second episode. So we talked about this last time, so that's why I want to talk about this too. So he was saying the second thing that happened was that when the oligarchy was established, the third tyrant, right? They called him and they asked him to bring this person, Leon from Salamis, and he didn't do it. He just says, I went home. So he was ordered to bring this person, essentially, right? The 30 tyrant said, Socrates, you and another few other guys, right? He wasn't the only one. There were like 4 or 5 of them, I don't know. And they were like, go and bring this guy here. They order him. And he didn't because he knew that they were going to kill this person, the Leon, and he personally didn't want to get involved with it, with the tyrant. So he said, I went home, and he said, you know what? Everyone thought that they would kill me, the tyrant, and they probably would have killed me actually. But as you know, it was very short lived. It lasted just about a year or so. So Socrates was saying, I was very lucky actually that the regime was overthrown and the tyrants, were no longer in charge because actually they probably might have killed me because of that, because I disrespect them. And they would kill people relatively easily, right? Um, so part of the accusation to Socrates as well is that some people claimed back then that he was involved with the tyrants and that he was right. So the democratic regime, once it's reinstituted, there was also suspicion that Socrates was aligned with the tyrants when they were in charge. And part of the reason is because, as you can see here, they did call him into the hall. So people probably saw Socrates entering the hall and talking with the tyrants, right? And voices started spreading that Socrates was, a lot was a part of or friends with that group, etc., or sympathetic towards them. Um, but indeed he wasn't, right. But that's quite interesting because we talked about the whole influence of the Peloponnesian War and the 30 tyrants on the Republic, on Plato, and you see here in the Apology as well. Socrates, is arguing here about the dangers of the public life and why he chose the private one, etc. And he recounts this episode of the tyrants. Okay, so that's about it for today. And yeah, see you.